Okay, tell me when we're on. I'm Greg Salmieri for the Salem Center at the University of Texas, Austin. I think this is going out as an edition of our Choose Your Issues podcast and just on our channel generally, but it's a little bit of a different kind of show, different kind of event. It came about because I was approached a few weeks ago by someone from the Law and Liberty program at the George Mason Law School, interested in whether we could set up some last-minute talks and asking me if I wanted to possibly do some talks for them, and recommending as a speaker someone I know from many years ago but haven't spoken to in I think 15 years until about a week ago, Devon Westhill. So we agreed to do a dialogue on one of the issues that or some of the issues that are near to that program's heart. And so this is a dialogue on the relationship between freedom of speech and the social justice, or the fight for a more just society, including I want to think a little bit about what we mean by each of those terms, what different people mean by each of those terms, why they are thought to be in conflict. Devon is the president of the Center for Equal Opportunity. He was the top civil rights official in the Department of Agriculture under the previous administration, and also worked in the Department of Labor. And Devon, I'll let you say a little bit about yourself and how you come to this topic.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Greg. Very nice to be here. I've given a couple of these talks on free speech, the intersection of that, or its role in social progress or social justice. We'll kind of try to define those terms as we go, but also in free speech role and advancement of civil rights in America as well. The way in which I came to this is that in my current role at the Center for Equal Opportunity, for the last 30 years, the organization has advanced an idea of colorblind equal opportunity for everyone in the United States, not just in how the government treats you, but also in private life as well. And civil rights is one of those ways in which we believe we promote an idea of non-discrimination or colorblind law and policy. And so in my current role for the last over 2 years, we've been doing that. One of the ways in which the organization has done that is to not just to promote a colorblind society, but also to oppose efforts to that go against that. So one topic that's certainly or potentially ripe for discussion here, perhaps as part of our discussion, is affirmative action or race preferences in college admissions, which currently has 2 cases pending before the Supreme Court, which could be something of interest to talk about in relation to the topics we'll talk about tonight. But in working with the Agriculture Department as well, as Greg said, as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, as the top civil rights official at the Agriculture Department, I've had the opportunity to study and to think about social justice, social progress, how we make social progress, how free speech plays into that, and of course, as a civil rights official and current civil rights advocate in a nonprofit organization, I've thought about how free speech supports that. I oftentimes go around the country talking about civil rights, specifically the law. And one of the reasons why free speech is kind of just personally important to me for that work professionally is that I talk about things that are oftentimes politically incorrect or unorthodox. And it's important to be able, for me professionally, to be able to discuss those issues without fear or threats and some of the other things we've seen certainly recently in the news and around the country, but over the history of mankind.
I should say, before we say anything more about freedom of speech and who can speak when, which is related, we have a microphone set up there, so I'm hoping we'll have some participation from you guys. And the way to signal if you want to talk is, come by that microphone. If there are a few of you, queue up by that microphone and when I see there are people there, we'll want to move a camera over to look at it and set it up. So it might not be on right when you get there, but if I notice people are there, I'll invite you to join in the conversation. That goes for anyone. I'm looking at this corner of the room because of how my chair is pointed. So you mentioned the controversy, the sense that freedom of speech is in jeopardy, it's sometimes threatened, or rather that it's needed to protect people presenting controversial ideas, politically incorrect ideas. Could you say a bit about how you see that fitting into the history of advocacy for a more just society and civil rights in particular?
Yeah, so the history of this country has been one where minorities, particularly racial and ethnic minorities, have been subjugated, oppressed, cast aside, and particularly in the 20th century, we saw a great movement throughout the entire course of the 20th century to right the wrongs that a good many people thought were wrong about how minority individuals in the country were treated. Black people, other racial minorities in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s civil rights movement, but also early in the 20th century as well. You think about the Silent Sentinels, for example, who were women who wanted the right to vote, and they stood outside the White House and to protest the fact that they didn't have the opportunity to vote. The important thing to remember about the Greensboro sit-ins, for example, the marches in Montgomery and other areas of the South, the civil rights movement of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and early in the 20th century, I mentioned the Silent Sentinels, is that all of these individuals had some things in common. They were minorities, right? They had views that were not liked by the majority of people in the country. They were going against a very entrenched power structure. And the only way in which they were going to sort of effectuate the social progress that they were looking to effectuate, whether that be the right to vote or to be treated equally before the law, was to express themselves, to speak, or else, and this is possible as well, and it did happen in some instances, but to be violent. There are sort of two different avenues by which the social progress could take place. But free speech, freedom of expression, sort of won the day. This also was important. Being able to express oneself and to hear what others have to say was important to association, right? These were not just individuals who were sort of minorities in the sense that they were black and brown people and so forth protesting inequality or oppression. They were also minority in size. So to really amplify their perspective and amplify their voices, they had to band together. The only way in which to do that was to know that they weren't alone. I think it's pretty clear, at least in the 20th century in America, that freedom of speech and freedom of expression was critical to the advancement of civil rights. I think it remains critical to social progress today. I think social justice is a goal and perhaps a part of social progress. Maybe we can get into that, but I don't think that anyone says today, well, we had these fantastic civil rights movements that we all agree were good for a lot of reasons today, that we're all done now. Social progress is all fixed in our country. We've sort of reached utopia. There's still things to be done, and I do think that it's not too much to say that freedom of speech is still really core to that.
So when I think of freedom of speech as an issue in America's past, in connection with fights against injustice, and particularly racial injustice, the things that come to mind most for me are abolitionism, abolitionist literature being against the law in much of the South, there being, and even where it wasn't against the law, people being killed, tormented, terrorized, right, for organizing along abolitionist causes. And then I think of Ida B. Wells and the campaign against lynching. And how did she, if you look at her career, her newspaper was burned down. She was told, if you come back to this town, you'll be killed. Other people were, and people are on the run because they're trying to say things that other people don't want them said. She reestablishes herself in another city where things are more friendly, but this is a constant threat for her and for lots of people, right? There are people who want to kill you, and either law enforcement is on their side or turning a blind eye. You're not free to speak without fear of violence. And I think freedom of speech is, at its root, the ability to not be afraid of violent reprisal, not be under threat of violent reprisal for saying the things you want to say. And that means having a government that will, one, protect you from people who want to who want to attack you for saying what you want to say. And here I mean in the most literal sense, punch you, kill you, shoot you, burn down your property for saying what you want to say. And two, a government that won't, even worse, get into the business of doing those things to you itself, persecute you for what you want to say. So those are the things that stand up to me as a kind of, large-scale historical example. Think of Frederick Douglass, think of Ida B. Wells, think of, all the people from, and I think it's the 19th century, as much as the 20th. But why is there thought, how is this relevant now in particular? What are the threats to, what are the issues on which there's a need to fight for justice now? And what are the ways, particularly justice for groups that have been historically marginalized or subjugated, and in what sense, and we could talk about what's meant by social justice and whether that's a valid concept in a moment, but whoever one thinks of as the heirs of the principles that the abolitionists were fighting for, that the anti-lynching crusade was fighting for, whoever you think of as the modern heirs to those principles, in what ways are their speech under threat now?
Yeah, so I think the best way to describe the threats that at least I see today to freedom of expression, freedom of speech, is to just talk about examples that we've seen. And also, let me start this way instead, and we'll go through some examples, and we'll talk about whether or not those are actual threats to speech and so forth. But in 2021, there was a big poll taken of something like more than 37,000 college students at like top 100 law school or top 100 colleges in the country. So these, it's not just like any old, any old school. These were, and it was a large sample size, 37,000 plus students. The question was, or questions, two that I want to mention here. One was, is it appropriate to shout down a speaker, basically protest such that you censor their speech with your own boisterous speech? Is it appropriate to do that at all? 66% of the 37,000 plus students answered in the affirmative. That's appropriate to do. Shout down someone else's speech if you don't like it. That is indicative of sort of a major threat among at least a proportion of the American public. College students, maybe 18 to 22-year-olds will just, but maybe not indicative of a larger section, larger section of the population. Even more disturbing about this, poll was the finding that 23% of the 37,000 plus who were polled, 23% said that it was okay to use violence to shut down speech that you disapprove of or that you don't like, that offends you in some way or whatnot. 1 in 4 college students are willing to use the violence, willing to punch you, willing to kill you, potentially, I guess, violence, to stop you from speaking. I think that is a pretty clear indication that there are some serious threats, at least maybe on college campuses, to the free expression of ideas. Now, we have specific examples that have been in the news. I don't know if folks know about all of these. It's hard to keep up with them, quite frankly. I'm a lawyer. I talk to a lot of lawyers and law students. The first one that comes to mind for me is the shouting down of a federal judge at Stanford Law School last month, which is striking in a number of different respects because one of them is those individuals who did that were by and large law students. They were not the undergraduates. That they might have been undergraduates at 2021 when this polling took place, but they weren't currently undergraduates when they did this practice. So you think that they have matured to a certain degree, professionally, intellectually, what have you. They understand perhaps the importance of allowing a speaker to give a perspective, you have some sort of deference or respect for a federal judge, so on and so forth. But this happened nonetheless, and and there are a number of other sort of striking elements to the Stanford situation, but there are a lot of these that have been happening. Another happened at the University of California, Hastings Law School, Yale Law School last year. One of the interesting sort of threads about all of these as well is that maybe they're not just sort of professional schools, they're very elite professional schools as well, which again sort of raises a concern that individuals who are going to major positions of leadership in very short period of time have these views hold these views on the freedom of speech or the freedom of expression in a public venue.
Let's back up a bit and think about whether and why this kind of thing is a threat to freedom of speech or is a violation of freedom of speech. We started with cases of people being killed, having their property destroyed, being beaten up for saying things. There have been some cases of people being beaten up in the last few years for expressing certain views. But the cases you were focused on were speakers being shouted down. So could you say a bit more about how you understand that being related to the freedom of speech? Some people might say, well, this is counter speech. There are people in the audience, they're speaking back. You're for speech. Why isn't this all to the good?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess one of the real question is sort of what is freedom of speech? I think at least maybe until recently, a very common understanding of what freedom of speech is, and I guess I'm sort of old school and I still subscribe to this, is that freedom of speech is essentially the ability to express oneself, whether that be through speaking, other expressive acts, or non-acts. Again, I think about the Silent Sentinels who simply stood with signs and so forth, but didn't speak at all. I think about a legal case called Tinker, a very important one, where students wore armbands to protest war. Burning the flag, for example, is the American flag is an example of that as well. But associated with that, the ability to sort of express oneself freely without, as you suggested earlier, fear of violent recourse against you, is the other side of the coin, is the ability to hear others as well. There is no genuine freedom of speech if others aren't allowed to hear what you have to say. In fact, that's one of the things that I find really disturbing about the shout down incidents and so forth that we've heard about for individuals who should appreciate sort of intellectual, sort of a robust intellectual environment in which to learn. If you are not sort of a supporter of free speech, there really is, I think, no limiting principle upon which you can set a boundary to prevent other speech from reaching your ears, right? You are closing off your own mind to others' speech. It's a sort of intellectual atrophy or intellectual death, really. You create a sort of an echo chamber situation where you homogenize what is available to hear.
So the idea is there are good reasons to want to expose yourself to a wide range of viewpoints. That's one point. But supposing you're someone who doesn't want to expose yourself to a wide range of viewpoints, you're still not interfering with someone's freedom of speech, but you are, if there are people who want to get together to hear one another, and you prevent them from doing so. So this is, I take it, how you understand what happened at Stanford and at Yale. There was a speaker who would come to give a speech. There was an audience who was there to listen to him. These people had followed whatever the proper procedures that were established on the campus to rent a room and maybe had invested money in it and had done whatever they were supposed to do to have this meeting in good faith. And other people who didn't want it to happen came and started shouting, jeering, doing something to prevent this event from taking place, a so-called heckler's veto. To give another kind of example of this that I'm familiar with because it involved some friends of mine, back in the early 2000s, or not early, it was around 2009, 10, there were one of my friends, Yaron Brook, and some other people from the Ayn Rand Institute were going around the country giving talks on college campuses about something to do with the war on terror. I forget exactly what the points were. And for some reason, of all people, a group of followers of Lyndon LaRouche, who's a kind of eccentric, oddball political candidate, I don't even know what he stood for, but he had a group of followers who would, for whatever reason, got onto this series of speeches and would show up in the audience and start singing loudly whenever the speaker started talking. And so they couldn't go out and give a talk because there'd be all this singing. They had to get security to escort these people out because you couldn't get a word in edgewise. This is a sort of heckler's veto by disrupting the event, not just protesting outside of it, not just having counter-programming, but actually interfering with the event itself. You prevent the speaker from being able to talk to the people who have come to hear him speak. It's maybe not, breaking anyone's bones or killing them, but it is stopping by your interference in the conversation, and not through means that are part of the conversation, a conversation from taking place, a speech from taking place. So this is the kind of thing that's happening in the case at Yale, in the case at Stanford. There have been some other cases lately. The people who are doing this, though, in these cases, think of themselves as justified, think of the speakers as toxic, problematic, supporting an unjust order. What do you have to say to that? Are there cases where this is okay? Are these them? What if it was a Nazi? What if the person was equivalent to a Nazi? How should we understand these kinds of cases?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think we have to be sort of radical in our view of freedom of speech. I mean, that was my whole attempted point in my plotting response. If we really don't have a limiting principle if we are not protecting that speech which offends us or is the sort of abhorrent speech that hopefully most people are not interested in hearing. But protecting that means that we protect the speech that we also think is really good and important. Part of the sort of question that we posed here with our title to this program was sort of, is there tension? What do we do? Is there a conflict between free speech and social justice? I mainly answer that no, but I'm curious what your thoughts are when it comes to answering in the affirmative that there is a conflict here. Here's how I might be charitable to individuals who would say, there is a conflict, and when there's a conflict, social justice ought to win out against free speech. And maybe this will require discussing sort of what social justice is as well. I've got some thoughts on that. But the idea, at least in part, I think, is that, for some people at least, we live in an environment the information age, where there's information everywhere. We have an abundance of information. And almost as a result of that, at least in part because of that, there's a scarcity of attention that you can grab, and attention span. Only certain speech is going to reach the attention that you need to make a change, to effectuate social justice, right? To moving, in my view, moving to a society that provides benefits and burdens more proportionally. And we can talk about exactly what that looks like as well. And when you allow speech that is bad for some reason or other, say Judge Duncan, who is shouted down at Stanford, the example that I used, let's say individuals thought his speech was going to be really harmful and bad. When you allow that to happen at one of the top law schools in the world by one of the most powerful people in the country, you really are drowning out lots of other speech, making it possible in this sort of environment that we live in, lots of information, but very scarce sort of attention. You're making it such that you're really elevating that type of speech as opposed to other speech, and that makes shouting him down a good thing.
So what is being elevated at the expense of what? I just lost track of the
So judge, for example, I'm not, I should say a judge who's speaking on a top law school campus. You are really elevating speech that maybe folks think is bad, and in an environment where
Wait, so are you
attention is scarce.
The judges is getting elevated, or the people who oppose the judge are getting elevated?
The judges.
I see.
The judge's speech is getting elevated, and
if this hadn't happened, Judge Duncan would have given this speech. Nobody would have heard or cared about it. There are probably judges speaking. The people there.
No, they certainly would have heard about it. He's a very powerful person, very important law school. No one's going to hear from the students unless
For example, the New York Times wouldn't have published something about Judge Duncan speaking at Stanford unless it caused a controversy, and yet it did. So
that's for sure.
Probably more people in the country know who this judge is now than did 2 months ago. I didn't know who he was 2 months ago. I think I know more about the court than your average person, and I learned about him too. So is the point that more attention is called to him, or that more attention is called to the point of view that finds him despicable?
I think potentially both, right? Without the protest in the way in which it was done, no attention at all, right, would have been called to the plight, whatever that is. I think it's a little bit murky, of the students who shouted him down. But it also at the same time elevates his point of view as well. But in the absence of that shouting down, right, we would be in this situation, again, that this isn't necessarily my point of view, but sort of playing the devil's advocate, and I'm free to speak here to do that. Does that not justify silencing or censoring of speech in that way? If but for doing that, these individuals who are really powerful and have these platforms are the ones who are really going to be able to share their view, as opposed to sort of the oppressed sort of minority view in a world today that we have lots of information, very limited attention.
I'm not sure who the powerful people are. The law school, or the student body at the law school, or
Judge Duncan is a very powerful person.
He is powerful, yeah.
He's a very powerful person.
And
he has a
other
perch
ways to get his message out.
That's right. And including through his opinions and so on. So my whole point here is that I think the students, if I'm being as charitable as possible, maybe not even the students, but people who would support a heckler's veto, would say, look, we live in an environment where there's limited time to get someone's attention about important issues. We ought not to be elevating the status quo, the people who already hold the power positions in society. And for that reason, we have a right, maybe even a duty, to cancel that speech, censor that speech, and to elevate our speech as often as we can in perhaps whatever method that we can.
So the heckler's veto is a tool of the powerless, in effect. If you
Right.
have the empowered people who don't represent a majority viewpoint, but somehow have a perch of power, you don't have the rest of us, or don't have a way to get a word in edgewise. But here's a way to do it: you can co-opt, take over their,
That's correct.
their opportunities. I mean, one thing that seems to me true about the Duncan case is there's been a lot of discussion of it, but hardly any of what he was going to say, or of what exactly his was supposed to make him unacceptable. He had ruled something in a case to do with trans rights, or a trans person who was looking for some kind of appeal that he wasn't granted, but I don't think it's become very clear in most of the media coverage just what happened, or just what his view of these issues are, or why they're so found so unacceptable. And I don't think it's very clear what the view of the students were. I think what the way the story has come across in most places I've looked at it is there's some kind of mayhem on Stanford's campus, and things are in disarray. And I don't think anyone's position on whatever the substance of the dispute over this judge was has gotten much attention.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I don't think what I understand him to be, have prepared a talk for was all that controversial. Is essentially the legal relationship between his circuit and the Supreme Court in cases that go from his circuit to the Supreme Court. I mean, something that you'd expect law students to want to hear about, and not particularly controversial. I think what was controversial, and it's fine to talk about this particular incident because it's fresh to some extent, and provides a number of different interesting ways to think about free speech and social progress. But was that he had advocated for many years before he was on the bench, for things that the students apparently didn't like, such as traditional marriage and so forth. And on the bench, there's at least one instance or one case that they thought he was being insensitive to a trans person, and that was enough. And I think that's largely what they, didn't like. I don't think there was anything actually in the prepared remarks that were supposedly offensive.
So let me say
Objectionable.
a little bit about why I think there's a conflict, or a thought conflict, between these things, free speech and social justice. I think they're both vague terms. I think free speech has a kind of principled meaning on which I defended, and I think of myself as an advocate and an absolutist for free speech, which is the right to not be have force initiated against you for expressing your opinions, the right not to be killed, imprisoned, robbed, etc., for speaking your mind. But it's often used by people who think that their free speech is being violated whenever they suffer any negative consequences for saying something. So if I say something at a party and everybody is aghast and doesn't want to talk to me, if I'm fired for saying something that my employer disapproves of, if I can't get a date because my dating profile has things on it that people don't like or whatever, I'm being rejected for my speech, I'm not being welcomed, I'm being castigated, I'm being discriminated against, and this is a violation of my free speech. And I don't think that's the right meaning of the concept free speech. I think often people are overly censorious about people who disagree with them and don't engage with them when they ought to, but cut them off or want to have nothing to do with them too quickly. But I think they're within their rights to do that, and I don't think it's an issue of freedom whether you are overly censorious of others or not, but an issue of what makes for a healthy discussion. So that's why there's a kind of vagueness in free speech. What's meant by it? The right to not be not be forcibly prevented from speaking your mind, or the demand that whatever you say be tolerated by your peers. And then on the issue of social justice, this is I take it in the broadest meaning. What we mean by social justice is our societies being just, the institutions of our society being just. obvious counterexamples to a society being just would be the society has slavery. It has laws that persecute one race at the expense of another, or one group of people based on ancestral condition at the expense of another. Persecuting isn't at the expense. They persecute one group of people and not another. They, in general, the law is not applied fairly and equitably. These are unjust institutions. There might be unjust cultural things that aren't a matter of how the law is structured, but there's just a tremendous prejudice against a certain group of people, and that is unjust. Whether or not the law should be involved in rectifying it, a more just society would be one in which that prejudice wasn't felt, and we can think of different kinds of injustices and prejudices there have been. In particular, there's a kind of Rawls influenced that's influenced by the philosopher John Rawls at Harvard. Movement that thinks of itself as for social justice these days, that has to do with distributions of goods and opportunities within society. In particular, the idea that they are the distributions we have now are unjust and need to be rectified. You could think of in racial terms, that is focusing on this issue with regard to race. Ibram X. Kendi is probably the most prominent person now defining and thinking about racism in these terms. So there's a kind of distribution-centric focus on justice these days that you often hear connected with social justice that comes out of Rawls. But I think the concept is wider than that. I think you could think from the perspective of people who disagree with Rawls about whether our society is just or not, understood in however you understand the concept justice. And you could think of people fighting to make it more just, or people prohibiting that, fighting back against that. If you, though, think about just the most abstract level, the idea that the society has been unjust in certain ways, and some of those ways are obvious. Women weren't tolerated in many places. Black people weren't tolerated in many places. Gay people weren't welcome in many places. Trans people certainly weren't. We had a Chinese Exclusion Act where you couldn't, come to this country if you were from China. Right? There were all kinds of prejudices, some of them embodied in law. If you take that as the backdrop, and you take the idea that there were things that people were comfortable saying in a context where these prejudicial, unjust attitudes were commonplace and all over the place, there were always things that you would get drummed out of polite society for saying. There were always things that it was taboo to say. There are always things that people would scowl at you for saying. But now what those things are have changed. And you might think that what those things are have changed for the better in some ways. Some horribly racist attitudes that it would have been perfectly okay to express at one point, perfectly okay in the sense that you wouldn't suffer much social harm for saying them, you now will suffer social harm for saying. And some responses to those attitudes that you would have suffered social harm for saying, for example, that people should be able to marry across from different races. At one point, it would have been anathema to say that you would have been drummed out of polite society for saying it. Now, not only are you not drummed out of polite society for saying it, you might be drummed out of polite society for saying the opposite, that there was any issue with that. If you think those kinds of changes are occurring, what things are within the Overton window to say and what things aren't, and you think there are people who are used to the old, bad, worse domain of what things were polite to say and what things weren't, and that those people are now feeling put upon, that they're no longer accepted saying the things they used to be allowed to say, they used to be tolerated saying. You might think that what's happening is our society is becoming more just, more tolerant of the kinds of idea expression that we should be tolerant of, and more intolerant of the kinds of ideas we shouldn't be tolerant of. And that some people are kind of reactionaries who are inveighing against this welcome change. And they cry, oh, my free speech has been violated, my free speech has been violated, when everybody objects to their going on a racist tirade or something. So I think there are actually cases where that is what's happened. But I don't think it's the majority of what's going on when people are concerned about free speech. But that's the kind of best case I could make for there is a conflict happening here, and there's something to be said on the anti-quote free speech side of it.
Yeah, it's interesting because so I don't want to agree with everything you say. I've got to disagree with some of this stuff, but I feel the same way. I mean, we've seen sort of this idea that cancel culture is what I think it's called is just really so bad and it's so awful for all these reasons and so on and so forth. Well, some things are cancelable, and that's perfectly fine. I don't think an element of the traditional understanding of robust and radical extreme freedom of speech and expression does not it does not come without consequences for the things that we say. My concern primarily is, silencing or censoring yourself because you believe that there's going to be some violent backlash against you because of what you have to say. I think we have to, if we really care about freedom of speech and all those, I think, really good things that come with it, and we can just begin naming all these fantastic things, you have to understand that there's a consequence to certain speech as well. And there's a consequence to sort of how you say things. I don't think that you get freedom of speech and, no consequence for, being an a-hole, in the way you say things. I think that's always been the case. We do see sort of this changing in what is appropriate to say without as much social, backlash or actually praise, and sort of a shifting towards things that you were able to say in yesteryear, not able to say today. But even then, the way in which you said things were important as well, and I think that is perfectly fine. I don't want to, police is too strong of a word, but to be serious about and thoughtful about in terms of how you say things, with the understanding that you could be canceled for something that you say today that you wouldn't have been canceled for yesterday. One thing I did want to it's not really too important, but I want to disagree, is that I do think that by and large, the perspective today on what social justice actually is the idea that for those individuals who consider themselves to be social justice advocates, by and large, is concerned with a society in which individuals within that society, no matter their background, have an equal proportional distribution of the burdens and benefits in society.
That's right. That's the kind of Rawlsian idea.
I think that's largely. There are lots of different definitions out there and thoughts that have been expressed and so on and so forth, but I think that is generally what people are saying when they say, I want social justice or I'm a social justice advocate. And I think that runs into some bigger issues as well of sort of the individual versus the group and how we treat individuals. But in any event, I think that's by and large what people think.
I think that's right. I should say now, I mentioned earlier if people want to jump in, they can go to the microphone, but I want to encourage anyone now in particular who wants to talk. We could say ask questions, but not just ask questions, add a point of view into the conversation. Feel free to go up there, and I'll keep an eye to see if anyone does.
While we're waiting on that, I did want to make one additional comment. So I posed to you what I thought being the most charitable view of individuals who sort of shout down very powerful speakers in a very powerful setting, given the backdrop of knowing that attention is scarce and there's lots of information out there, and the people who are going to get that attention are those individuals who are powerful and have a powerful microphone and megaphone and so on and so forth. One of my concerns about the idea that that's okay is the ratchet effect. Today, you may be in sort of the majority of the mob that's able to do that for things that you don't like or you find reprehensible about a speaker. But what about tomorrow? If you have a view that you'd like to share, that folks think is reprehensible, which is, in the eye of the beholder, what's to stop? the mob from shouting you down as well, or shouting down the next person. We get into the situation where we just have a bunch of shouting matches instead of this situation where we have a robust sort of exchange of ideas, and the best ideas hopefully win the day, but we have a battle of ideas. The ratchet effect.
To me, the initial idea that you can get a voice for the powerless by doing this doesn't seem to me to be realistic in the first place. And I can't think of any case where it worked. I mean, if you have maybe some kind of dictatorship and hardly anybody has a microphone, and there's this one occasion where you can grab the microphone and say what you want, you could maybe imagine it working. But if you're able to disrupt, an event by a whole lot of people screaming and their disruption being heard and over drowning out the event, it must be because you have a lot of people behind you, and a lot of people behind you and nobody able to stop you. And in any case I can think of like that, you would have a lot of other outlets. And I can't really think of a case in which people who otherwise were hard-pressed to find an outlet to express their view want an outlet to express it in that way. And it's hard for me to think of how there could be such a case. We have someone at the mic. Puya, would you mind, I'm just talking to the person doing our tech, making one of the cameras on the two of us here and the other turn to him? Kind of low-tech situation here with
it's more high-tech than I can manage.
and get his mic on. And is the other mic on both of us? Is the other camera on both of us? Good, thanks. Okay, so, all right, you're on the air.
I'm Ryan Sywald. I'm a master's student here at UT. Thank y'all for doing this. Feel like it's very informative. My question's for Mr. Westhill. The perception I've kind of had of how you're like framing this like free speech and social justice debate is that some of these old ways that the civil rights movement and social justice has kind of been ushered in, like those were the good ways of using free speech as a movement for social justice, and some of the new like 21st century last 10, 20 years are more the violation of free speech in order to advance social justice. But like one of the examples I think you gave was the like counter sit-ins, like in like the Jim Crow South. And I think in a way that's by like putting yourself in those spaces and like taking spaces up at the counter, you're depriving other people of like a freedom of movement, which I feel like is kind of lumped in with this freedom of speech, like 5 freedoms given to us by the Bill of Rights. And so is there a fundamental difference between that, where you're like are causing a blockage towards other people's freedom to do that, and then these shout downs where you are blocking someone else's freedom to speak?
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't fully thought that through. And I might punt to Professor Salmieri as the philosopher on the panel here to think that through. Maybe you've thought a little bit more about that in terms of how at least the sit-ins, as I understand your question, were themselves blocking maybe not some right in the same sense that you're sort of shouting down a speaker who has, you would think, a right to free speech, maybe like a human right, as opposed to maybe an economic right to sit at the counter as well. Now it's taken up by protesters. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's that big a difference between rights to speak and rights to act and exchange economically. I think they really form a unit and aren't separable. When you violate one, you end up violating them all. But it's not directly if you're talking about the Greensboro sit-in and so forth, it's not directly that someone was trying to speak in those seats. It's that they were occupying the seats and interfering with the ability to do business. As a general matter, I think sit-ins and other protests that involve occupying somebody else's property against their will are wrong and are violations of rights. Sometimes they're protests that I agree with the aims of, but I don't think that's a proper means of it. Now, the protests against segregation are a sort of difficult and confusing case not confusing, but there are several issues involved, because it's not as though the Woolworths was the one that was segregating the counter, right? It was a law that you couldn't, in most states, if you wanted to have a counter that served black and white people alike, you couldn't. So there was a law against doing it. Maybe the particular restaurateur wanted that law. Maybe they were opposed to it. I don't think we know. Certainly, there were some who were opposed to those laws and had to abide by them anyway. There were some cases in New Orleans, in particular, where that was an issue. It was the companies who didn't. I want to have a restaurant that serves everybody, and they weren't allowed to. So in this case, it's in part that business that was, occupied. They weren't the ones who were at fault here, although you could say maybe they were at fault for not standing up against this just law. But the law in that case is so pervasively unjust, it's hard to know where to start in fighting it. I don't really think that was the right way, but I think it was a case where there's enough ambiguity involved in who's at fault that I consider it a kind of gray area. I'm acting in the role of director of this show as well as someone on it. But I think we should keep a camera on that microphone, and this way people can come and go and just keep the other one on a two-shot of us.
Director Salmieri, I like it. And so, having thought about this for 2 minutes now, fantastic question. I want to continue to ruminate on it, and I don't have any really enlightening comment to add, except to say I think there's a substantial difference between preventing something that rises to the level, in my view, of almost sort of a human right to be able to speak and express yourself, express your ideas, preventing that, censoring that, shouting that down, and not being able to sort of get a burger at the Woolworth counter. But I still want to think about that. I think that's a really interesting point.
So what do you think about that image of the people sitting at the counter was, came back in the social, I've never really laughed, but it came back in the social imagination in a meme a few years ago. And it was in response to the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. Mm-hmm. So here's gay marriage was, I forget if it was after it was deemed constitutional in the whole country or before, but there was people were getting married who were gay. There was a owner of a cake shop who didn't want to, he was opposed to gay marriage, didn't want to make a cake for a gay wedding, and was sued for this. And the question is, does he have to make the cake? Is he violating their civil rights in some way for not making a cake? And we saw this, I saw a meme with this image, these people sitting at the counter, and it said, we had this argument already. You don't get to decide, who your customers are. If you have some bigoted or arguably bigoted view about what kind of people, should be able to have your service, it's not up to you. You don't get to decide that. And my sense is that they are the same issue. That I think that aspect of the civil rights law is wrong. I think horrible, irrational, bigoted people who don't want to serve certain clientele are, within their legal right, what ought to be their legal rights not to do so. And the rest of us are within our legal rights, and I think morally ought to condemn them, ostracize them, castigate them, not deal with them, boycott them for doing it. And I think that's the same way. I think it should be handled the same way with racism as prejudice against gays or anything else. But I think, given the way the law was decided, how different are these cases?
Well, first of all, I'll say I am not unsympathetic to your view of the civil rights law when it comes to that point. Specifically, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case really turned on something that I think is actually closer to the subject of this talk than that, which is the concern was that this wasn't just a cake baker like you can go to the local grocery store and they give you a sheet cake or something like that. This was a person who created very elaborate and specialized pieces of artwork.
His artistry was involved.
Precisely. So
I
this
would sell it to anybody.
Precisely.
But I'm not going to design a cake.
Precisely. So this was closer to freedom of speech or freedom of expression. This was his expressive conduct and putting together a cake, or designing it in such a way to celebrate something that he thought or that he disagreed with, such that it rose to the level of compelled speech, which is another concern when it comes to the free speech issue. So, in that context, I certainly agree with the outcome of Masterpiece Cake Shop and the ideals of freedom of expression, that you ought not to be compelled to express something that you don't want to compel either.
I agree with the way the case was decided too. I just want to see the pushback go further.
Sure.
But one thing I worry about with these kinds of laws, incidentally, that compel people to deal with one another when they don't want to, whether they don't want to because of a prejudice or for some other reason, whether that prejudice is irrational or for some other reason, is I don't think it works to force people together. I think the kind of hatreds, prejudices, animosities fester, come up in other ways. But I also worry that it has other effects on politics. So right now, for example, there's a lot of sentiment opposed to immigration. I myself am very in favor of much laxer immigration policies than we have, letting a lot more people in. And I think there are rights-based reasons to want that. But one thing that I worry about, and I think somebody would worry about, is if you have the view that the people from a certain country are a certain way, maybe it's an irrational prejudice you have, or maybe it's a reasoned concern that how they treat children or women or this or that is something that I'm worried about having in my community. If you were allowed to determine how you deal with those people, I don't want them to live in my apartment complex, I don't want them to go, whatever it was, you could say, well, it's not up, you can't keep them out of the country, but you can decide who to deal with and who not. You can try to insulate yourself or isolate yourself from people that you might have a concern about. And there are, situations that you might have some concern about someone. I think most of the concerns people have are more bigotry than anything else, but there are situations where something could not be. But if as soon as someone's in the door, you have to serve them, you have to hire them, a category of person, I think one of the places that the resentment then moves to is then we shouldn't let people in the country. Once they're in the country, I have to serve them, I have to hire them, I have to.
Interesting.
The same animosity doesn't go away, and I think it just, the bubble under the rug gets shipped to different places, and I think sometimes to worse injustices. I mean, if I was somebody from El Salvador or something trying to get away from a horrible situation there and wanting to come over the southern border of the country, I'd be much happier with a situation where I was allowed to do that, and then I had to deal with some people who didn't want to hire me because they didn't like El Salvadorans, than a situation where, because of this, I'm not able to get in at all.
Yeah, I would just comment and say that I generally sort of am sympathetic to the idea that forcing people to be together on the one hand is sort of, an example of injustice, and that it creates a lot of other problems, as you suggested, festering of grievances and so forth, and the bubble under the rug kind of moves around and so forth. But I think we have seen over the course of decades now after the Civil Rights Movement, and you don't know which one where the causation is, and perhaps is just corollary, but we have moved in a direction in this country where it's increasingly multi-ethnic, multiracial, and based on polling and so on and so forth that I've seen, many people sort of have different and in my view, better views of race relations. Just take, for example, the interracial marriage rate has gone up and up and up since the 1950s and 1960s. I don't know that was caused, at least in part, by sort of this forced integration of people who maybe disagree with or don't want to interact with each other by the civil rights laws. But that's something that's happened in this country, and it's interesting to think about the role that the civil rights laws might have played in that.
It's very hard to assess historically the role of the civil rights laws because they wouldn't have happened unless there was a strong consensus among a lot of the country in favor of anti-racism, right? And so it's hard to separate out the effects of that consensus itself from the effects of some laws that were passed due to that consensus. And then insofar as there's backlash, it's hard to separate out what's a backlash to the law and what's a backlash to the consensus. And I don't know how to do that. I have some views abstractly about what kinds of laws and what kinds of justice and injustice you would expect to have, what kinds of effects that make me expect certain things to have followed from certain parts of the law and certain things to have followed from others, and certain things to have followed from the cultural currents and certain things to have been pushbacks. But to establish it empirically, it's just very hard to do because we don't have controls for this kind of thing. We don't have a world or a place in which there was an anti-racist movement but not this kind of law. And the Civil Rights Act is complex, of course, because it has several different provisions. Some of them are getting the government out of the business of discriminating, and some of them are banning private parties from discriminating. And in some cases, the private parties had been mandated by law previously to discriminate. And, there's just a lot to unravel there.
And allow me just to wrap that area of conversation up with saying that those social currents that we can't disaggregate well, right, and analyze this aside from the other elements like civil rights laws and how we've progressed over that period of time was driven by the ability to speak freely, to associate freely, and to express oneself. And that brings us back around to the conversation for today.
We've got someone else at the mic.
In terms of a potential conflict between free speech and social justice, if we mean social justice in the more Rawlsian way, isn't there something at the root of that conception of social justice that is also at the root of the kind of anti-free speech attitude? And it's a kind of deterministic premise. So one of the arguments you'll hear for why we need to redistribute, as you said, benefits and burdens is that a lot of the outcomes of people's life is a matter of luck and things beyond their control, and the kind of environment they had shaping them as they grew up. And so, it's not just a matter of, this kind of idea of that the self-made man is kind of naive, and that the more sophisticated perspective is we have to understand all these things that are determining us, and that's why it's right to redistribute things. But it seems that's similar to the attitude of the kind of comparison where the old style of the way you should react to ideas you don't like. There's the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But then what you see with ideas like hate speech or with trigger warnings is that that in the same way that things can determine your life outside your control, there's the ideas can just it's not that sticks and stones can break your bones, that the ideas can actually affect you, right? There's hate speech, or that there's this harmful words, and that there's blurring of the idea of speech and violence. And so isn't it like, if we're taking social justice more in this Rawlsian way, isn't it the determinism explains both the social justice advocacy, but also the anti-free speech attitude of the people involved in this?
It might be more a philosophy professor question than a lawyer advocate question. But do you want to shot at it?
No.
Should we redistribute the burden?
So I think we should. You take the burden, I'll take the benefit. I will say I've not studied philosophy since I was a student of Professor Salmieri's some 15 years ago, but I still very much enjoy it, and I'm learning a lot from his comments, so I'll defer.
So I think there is something deterministic or not focused on individual agency and the role of thought in life that I think is a feature both of Rawls's view and of the running together of speech and harming someone that we find. But I think there's a lot. Both are big topics, and there's so much to say to bring out the role of free will in each that I'm not sure that we could make that clear or objective without giving a lecture on each of those points. So I don't know how much to say by way of comparing them here. And we haven't really said much about the Rawlsian social justice view. So why don't we start there? And I'll this one I will put back to you, which is, what's wrong with that view? I mean, if there are unfair burdens and benefits distributed, why shouldn't we want to change that? And what's meant by unfair? I mean, isn't it the case you talked about there being oppression and horrible mistreatment of people in the past in this country, maybe still, but if only in the past, doesn't that have legacies? Shouldn't something be done to try to rectify it? What's wrong with that?
I actually don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think we should be attempting to, by and large, provide equal opportunity to the benefits of citizenship in this country. Where I think social justice goes wrong is by trying to engineer the outcomes to benefit certain groups over individuals in the distribution of benefits and burdens. So, for example, we just look at obvious things. There are socioeconomic and other achievement gaps that we see that fall along racial lines and ethnic lines in this country. Many, under the banner of social justice, would say, that is wrong in the sense that we ought to do something about it. And there's also something sort of inherently problematic in the way in which our society is configured that's leading to that. Maybe that's the case, maybe it's not. But one of the ways in which we might address that, I see some social justice advocates suggesting, is that we ought to be looking at those things like the person's race, providing, and we've talked about this in the case of the Supreme Court cases on college admissions, benefits to certain people because they are of a certain group, their membership, and not to others, or to hold others back. Aside from just neutral treatment, hold them back because they have too many benefits already, right? They're born with rich parents or parents who are, both parents are in the household and married, or, these sorts of things that provide those sorts of benefits that oftentimes lead to better outcomes for them. I think that's problematic.
You're saying we want to try to engineer the society for equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. The outcome is the distributions that the Rawlsians want, or the social justice so-called people want. And
I think that's right. Push back against me when it comes to the engineering of equal opportunity.
Well, it just seems to me that one generation's opportunity is the previous generation's outcome. So if one generation's outcome is that, say, I'm richer than you, let's just imagine, then as a result of my being richer than you, my son maybe will have more opportunities than your children, or vice versa. And if we just play that forward and backwards enough in history, maybe the descendants of slave owners, having been rich from their slave owning, will have more opportunities than the descendants of the slaves. The opportunities are unequal because the parents are economically unequal. The parents are uneconomically equal because their parents were economically unequal, and going back to some cases of what anybody would consider injustice. So it seems to me that I have a hard time understanding how we could separate the ideas of equality of opportunity from equality of outcome in the way that people often want to.
My perspective is that equal opportunity means that you're not barred from pursuing your own interests, such by some arbitrary barrier, such as being black or being a woman or something of that nature. That's not to say that we're all born equal. That's in the sense that we all have rich parents, or we all have poor parents, or we all have the ability to, with proper coaching and so on and so forth, to shoot a jumper or to catch a football or those sorts of things. We're not equal in that sense. What I mean by equal opportunity is the elimination of arbitrary barriers to paths that one may choose to take in public life.
So that makes sense to me when I think about a particular policy for a particular decision that's being made. I'm looking to hire someone, and how do I decide to hire them? Do I have some kind of quota system or preference for someone who had this or this feature or this or that passed, or I'm looking to admit someone to a school, or do I think like, here's what's required to do the job well, here's what I think is required to get the most out of an education from my school, and I come up with some way to test that, and then I apply that test to everybody equally, and then whoever gets the highest marks on it or whatever, they're the best person for the job, the best candidate for the spot, etc. And so I can see it as equality of opportunity as a policy for making certain decisions. You have a criteria for the decision, and it's not considering anything other than that, and you're indifferent, in effect, to how the person got to the place of being the best applicant. You want to hire the person who's best at doing accounting. Maybe they're best at doing accounting because they had a lot of advantages early on, and so they got to be really good at accounting. Maybe they got best at being accounting because they overcome tremendous disadvantages, and they were just so dogged and determined and had such innate talent or whatever that they got to the top despite every disadvantage. You're indifferent to that. You just want whoever can do the accounting best. But when we're talking about like promoting it as a matter of public policy, I don't know. The rhetoric just seems, even in these cases, not the essential to me. The essential is, what's the purpose of this position, and how do we find the right applicants for it? And we don't want to create a special inequality of opportunity by selecting for the wrong traits. But I don't see it as trying to engineer for equality. But let's think about the admissions cases is the case where it's most in discussion now. We've got these cases before the court, and I don't know. It just seems to me admissions processes are so strange on so many metrics. In the first place, it's hard to know what to say about them. That is, if someplace, a part of me, and I think most of me, likes the idea of you just have some measure of what will it take to excel in this school to get the most out of what we have to offer, and then you find a way to find the people who can most do that, and then you let them in regardless of anything else. But it seems like a lot of what schools are doing are trying to create populations that'll have to craft the incoming class, and so many factors go into that crafting. Alumni donors. How do we keep this sports team working well? How do we get a group of people that'll want to be in the same room with one another, or that'll challenge one another enough? And I don't know which of those. It seems to me like the which of those criteria should and shouldn't be in there and how they should be weighted probably has a lot to do with one's view of pedagogy, and like different schools maybe should have different views of pedagogy and different philosophies of what they're trying to accomplish. I don't know. Race is a kind of complicating factor because there's all this law on it dating back to the civil rights movement.
Yeah, that's right. But I would say that there are things that are clearly related to pedagogy and other things that are not. And one of the reasons why race preferences and so forth in selecting college applicants for admission has been, at least in part based on their race, has been so controversial, is because that's so far and away from and apart from any legitimate concern about pedagogy that, I think it's appropriate to have had that controversy for such a long period of time. And quite frankly, I will say, I know this is not the subject of the talk, but I did give a presentation on this yesterday at the University of Houston. These cases, the use of race in these instances, no one has really been able to describe, at least to my satisfaction, I think to the satisfaction of many individuals, how there are educational benefits that flow from simple sort of skin deep diversity on campuses. I was explaining to the law students I was talking to yesterday the answers that were given at oral argument in these cases back in October, and the answers were just answers that you would expect if you have a diversity of viewpoints or views from people who have different experiences, who have lived different lives in a setting together. But it did not rise to the level of, okay, well, someone has a different skin color than me, I'm really learning better now. I've not seen that actually happen. I don't think there's a good pedagogical reason to promote that sort of idea.
If you look at what came out in some of the memos from Harvard and elsewhere, I mean, there's just what seems clearly prejudicial thinking about Asians. They don't have good personalities. It looks like what was said about Jews in earlier eras. And if there are going to be laws against racial discrimination, which there are, what's actually seems to be happening in these cases look like is clear violation of.
They ought to be enforced.
Could have. I'm again opposed to those laws, except as they apply to state actors. And I wonder if the existence of those laws has stopped flexible thinking about what are the different goals different institutions might have in crafting an incoming class, and what role should race play or not play. And I think in general, it shouldn't play a role, and there's a strong burden of proof on anyone saying it should. But you can come up with situations in which, for certain educational goals, say, bridging racial divides, which may be an important feature of some educations in some places, where you'd think some kind of race balancing is something that should happen.
That strikes me as reminiscent of the comment that you made regarding forcing association of different races, like the Greensboro situation. As
well, it would have to be unforced, and it would have to be someone's pet pedagogy.
I see.
That they think if we have a school that's in this mix with the population, it'll, help people learn to interact with more types of people. I suspect it really wouldn't, because, and then you have to think about who's going to apply to this and who wants to be the token of, I want to be the, this presentation, whatever.
There's so much I could say on this, but.
So we mentioned knowing each other a ways back, and you mentioned having been a student of mine back when I taught at Chapel Hill. Or I don't think you said that, but that's where we were met in a philosophy class back then. We haven't spoken since. I'm curious what you think of some of the goings on this very issue at Chapel Hill since our time there. So one of the things that happened is, what was your take on Silent Sam? That was one of these statues.
I don't know anything about it.
You don't?
I don't know anything about it. Is this the Confederate statues?
Yeah, well, it was, remember that big thing right, what's the name of the main street?
So I spent most of my time driving into campus, going to your classes and some other classes that I had, and driving home. I lived in Cary, so I wasn't even in town. So I would come in and I would leave. So I didn't have the same traditional sort of college student experience. I was older, and so.
There was a marble white statue on Franklin Street was the main drag.
Franklin.
Right on Franklin Street on the quad. It was called Silent Sam. It was not a Confederate. It wasn't like a statue of General Lee or something. But it was a statue. So it wasn't celebrating Confederate, military achievement or thought achievement or something. But it was meant to be a commonplace Confederate soldier. I think his gun was unloaded or something, and there were a bunch of these statues at different places. And it was meant to, I'm not sure exactly what the point of it was, but it was dedicated to peace in some sense because the gun's now unloaded. It's silent, there aren't the bullets in it. But some kind of memorial, I think, was dedicated to that, to all the students from the university who had fought on the Southern side in the Civil War, some kind of commemoration of them. I was never, when I was at the campus, too thrilled with that statue. It always seemed to me too much of a Confederate heritage that was being kept alive. But it wasn't like, if there was a General Lee statue, it was much subtler than that and officially for the fallen students. There had been a lot of discussion about should this statue come down at various times. A lot of faculty were opposed to it. A lot of students were opposed to it. It was just one of those things that was a hot potato issue. But then sometime maybe it was around 2015, it was after I had moved on and was, I think, in Boston, which is where I moved to from North Carolina. It was pulled down by a bunch of students with ropes. So it wasn't, there had been some,
I may remember
some people
this.
wanted to get rid of it, some didn't. There was some going through the, faculty in town process, and it was there was a big protest movement and people just toppled it. And then there was some issue, should it get put back up? The town of Chapel Hill and the university and the state were at odds with one another, and eventually somehow it got shipped somewhere else and isn't there. What do you make of this?
Well, I think I may remember that instance, but there are a lot of those things happening at that period of time all over the country. Protests against monuments and so forth to Confederacy and other quote unquote.
After the kind of Dillon Roof shooting, and there was a lot of
correct, yeah, right, correct. So again, I may or may not remember this particular instance or not, but by and large, my own personal view when it comes to this, which may be somewhat unusual, but again, I've got the ability to speak freely here as a man who was raised in the South. My father's black. I thought most of, I actually wrote a letter to the editor long before this ever happened in my hometown of Gainesville, and they wanted to try to get rid of Confederate statues again long before this particular thing happened. That there are bigger fish to fry. I didn't feel like this was, and in this particular case, not all that offensive, such as a statue of Lee on a steed or something of that nature. I actually, in my letter to the editor, wrote that there was in a courthouse outside of Gainesville, Florida. I think it's the Baker County Courthouse. There is a mural that's painted in the courthouse that has Ku Klux Klan members painted in the mural. I don't know if it's still there, but so we ought to maybe be more concerned about that in the last, in our House of Justice or whatever you want to call a courthouse, as opposed to some of the statues like the ones that you're describing that aren't actually commemorating or exalting the Confederacy or white supremacy or slavery or those sorts of things. But I saw the statue stuff as mostly performative, although I did think that some people were sincere that these really took some emotional toll on them, but it didn't really for me. But in any event, I don't remember that particular instance really well.
I mean, there is an issue of what statues we have says about us as a culture, what we're commemorating and what we're celebrating. And I think it matters if they're public monuments versus if they're private. It matters in different ways in each case. If you go to some place and everybody on their lawn has an admiring statue of Hitler, as I say, I don't want to stay in that place, right? There's something wrong with this town. Maybe they're within their rights to do it, but I don't feel comfortable in a town where everyone's got that. And I didn't feel comfortable when I was driving through some parts of upstate New York, and so everybody had Confederate flags all over the place. Like, this isn't even where the Confederacy was. What are you people doing with this here? I don't want to stop in this town. But it's their house, it's their right. But I still think that speech means something, and it deserves some pushback. This was around that same time when the Confederacy went national again. both because of people rejecting to Confederate symbology and other people reactionarily taking it up. I assume if I had gone through that same part of Buffalo 5 years earlier, I wouldn't have seen all these. It wasn't Buffalo, but it was on my way up to visit some friends in Buffalo. Wouldn't have seen those Confederate flags there. But when it's on state grounds, we're in effect saying that this is someone who the state regards as a hero, who the state regards as worthy of respect. It says something about our political culture. And if what's being celebrated is someone not just who had racist attitudes, but whose main role in history was as who's remembered precisely for having fought to retain those attitudes, and in particular, if they're a traitor to the government that we're allegedly a part of now and a traitor on behalf of retaining those attitudes, I think there is something really wrong about those kind of symbols being up on state lands or on, as symbols by the state. And I think it's doesn't, I think, make proper what happened with Silent Sam, which I think was one of the least bad kinds of cases of this, as compared to Lee on his steed kind of case. But I think those should be removed. But I think it really matters that the removal happen through a kind of orderly rule of law constitutional process and not through kind of vigilante justice, because that kind of breakdown of rule of law where people are doing things by direct action is dangerous, and dangerous in particular to whatever people have the least power to get protection from the state.
Yeah, no, I think we could break that down in a lot of different ways, but I know that we're running low on time. Yeah. On the one hand, I'd love to continue this conversation. We got at least one person at the mic, and then I have another thought I was hoping to wrap up. So
let's talk to you and see where that goes, and then we'll go to your closing thought.
Yeah, so I'm curious, to sort of get on the topic of sort of the conflict between free speech and social justice, of whether or not, I guess, one of the, like you said, you have examples of, in the past, it seems very clear that there's examples of, the close, the synergy of, free speech and social justice, of people being able to use the rights of free speech to advance things that we see as, positive movements in social justice, and be able to protest things that they saw as unjust, and move towards a better state of society. And sort of trying to, one thing that I'm curious about is sort of, the sort of how we can make the distinction between those forms of protest that we, a lot of people see as, positive movements in society versus some of the behaviors that are done in the name of social justice in more recent times that people are objecting to more.
Will you say what you're either objecting to yourself or expecting people to object to?
Sorry, what was that?
Could you give a sample of the more objectionable or thought to be objectionable behavior?
Yeah, just sort of modern, like you're talking about, like modern shouting down of speakers, cancel culture of, people being potentially fired or things for certain beliefs and stuff like that. One distinction that I'm curious if what your thoughts are on is whether there's been a increase in the modern movements of focusing more on attacking people as opposed to ideas. And whether or not sort of one thing that people find more objectionable about the modern behaviors is people focusing on sort of seeming to push back more personally against people as opposed to objecting to particular ideas. Like you're talking about, like the judge that was shouted down wasn't really talking about any sort of particularly controversial topic. They were more objecting to his presence more in a personal sense. And if I'm curious if you see that as that kind of behavior is a clear distinction between sort of modern behaviors and like these previous sort of social justice movements, whether these previous social justice movements were more focused on objecting to ideas and respecting the people and objecting to the ideas, and that sort of has been changed in the modern times, and if so, what you think what you think the relationship of that is to sort of the conflict between free speech and social justice is.
Yeah, I think I understand your thought there, and I'll this kind of leads into some of the stuff I wanted to wrap up with, so that's helpful. I think that one of the themes that I've seen in these instances of shouting folks down, censoring speech, and so forth, is a really odd situation in where young adults sort of seem to be clinging to sort of childhood proclivities. What I mean by that is they demand to be more comfortable in sort of these academic settings, as we've sort of described. There are other instances as well that we could have gone into, but they refuse to sort of build up resilience to hearing things that they don't like. They don't like the ideas, don't get me wrong, but they sort of have this childish view. They haven't grown out of it seems like, which differentiates them from previous generations of about the same age, I think, of being able to separate or understand that there's not always a clear distinction between good and evil, and that it's okay, and you're almost probably right to view people who disagree with certain of your ideas as evil, not just wrong, but that they're evil. I think there's a lot of that going on here. And I mentioned that this kind of ties into some thoughts I wanted to make, because I'm just a simple country lawyer. I'm not a highfalutin, a professor of philosophy like Greg or anything. But so I like to think about freedom of speech, social progress, and so forth, and how that affects on the ground the individuals that I'm mostly trying to reach with the talks that I'm having, which are undergraduate students, some graduate students I know that we have in the room here as well, but you're sort of young adults that maybe could get captured or sort of wound up in the furor of all this stuff related to speech and shouting it down and being on the right side of history and all these sorts of ideas and so forth. I think, unfortunately, if you do get caught up in that, and that you aren't sort of radical on the side of being tolerant of free speech and maybe not agreeing with what people have to say, but understanding that it's important to allow them to be able to say that for various benefits that you get for that, for yourself and also for society. I think you lose out on a whole suite of other benefits as well, to your own development intellectually, but also in moving into genuine adulthood, Western adulthood, of understanding that to live in society with others in a peaceful way, you have to be tolerant. You need to build up resilience. You have to be courageous. To develop intellectually, hearing other ideas is critical to that. These sorts of things that I think a good many of these folks are, who have been involved in these sorts of incidents, are really against, or sort of holding out, hoping, they're just going to win the day by putting forward sort of this behavior that shuts down what they don't like. And I think not grappling seriously and thoughtfully with the fact that I mentioned, drawing the line between good and evil is not quite as clear as we would like it to be, once we're at a point where we're wise enough to understand that. Hopefully that maybe got to some of your question.
I'm skeptical. This is also responding to the question. If there was some time recently when people were so good at this stuff, I think we're in a particular flare-up of censoriousness these days, a particular flare-up of people focusing on the person rather than the ideas. But I think there are very few times in history when the intellectual debate is really focused on ideas. It very easily becomes about people. If you go back, and even if you look in, debates about communism and anti-communism, how much was it really about the principles of how a society should be organized, and what is the principle behind communism, and why is that evil if you think it is, as I do? And what is the opposite to that, which is a good principle? And how much was it about these guys, they're Reds, right? Particular people that you're identifying and tarnishing anyone who had anything to do with them. Discussions tend to skew towards the personal, the tribal, the vilifying, rather than towards the ideas. It's easier. And I think it takes effort to go back to the ideas. But I do think part of what makes ideas matter is that they flow from and contribute to what kind of people we are. And in the take ideas seriously crowd, in the crowd of people who think free speech matters because we need to take ideas seriously, because ideas matter, and we should therefore always think about the ideas and never about the people, I sometimes think there's a kind of trivializing of ideas that happens. There's a kind of person who prides himself on only wanting to think about the ideas, and he's willing to discuss any idea with anybody, and it's all about the ideas, and therefore it's really important to me that I'm willing to talk to you no matter what you think, because I'm about the ideas. And too often people like that pride themselves on being promiscuous with their associates, on it not mattering to people what the people they're dealing with think. But if ideas matter, they matter because of who they make us, what kind of people they make us. They might make us better people or worse people. They might make us act in ways that are good for us or bad for us, or good or bad for the people around us. And it matters to me what people believe. It matters to me what I believe. There are some views that I think make you a worse person, and others that make you a better person. And some views that I think are generally come from virtues that people have that lead them to these views, and other views that generally lead to vices that people have. I think that's true, and I think it matters. But one of the things that I take as an implication from that is that you really want to be sure you're right about these things. If ideas contribute to good and evil, you want to make sure you have the good ideas and not the evil ones. And part of doing that is you really have to listen to and think about all of the ideas. And so while it might be the case that you want to form associations only with people who agree with you on certain things for certain purposes, that you want to form coalitions for the good, you want to make sure it's also an important part of your life, that you're having channels to explore the different ideas, that you're talking sometimes to people, not saying kumbaya with them who disagree with you, but making sure you're giving them a hearing, and they're giving, and letting yourself be heard by them, and letting your ideas be in test with them. And to have that, you need to have a political regime where everybody's free to speak their mind, where everybody's free to associate with one another around hearing one another's points of view, and then sometimes distancing from one another's points of view. And then you need to use that freedom wisely to sometimes form advocacy organizations with exclusive principles and strict membership. Other times attend debating societies and places where you're going to hear the full range of views, to have libraries that have everything in them and try to seek out those libraries and make sure you're testing your views against the widest thing. But it comes not from expecting ideas to have no consequences, not from taking them lightly, but from taking them so seriously. That's why I think freedom of speech is important, and part of what it's important for is creating different kinds of associations, some of which are very welcoming of wide ranges of speech, and some of which are, for different purposes, more constrained. I have one other thing I kind of want to say that's less suitable as a closing note, though, so maybe you'll have a good closing note after it. Just reacting to something I said before, because I feel like in making the best case for some of the distribution of social justice ideas, put out some ideas, and I'd like to kind of answer them a bit or indicate where there might be answers to them. I talked about some of the disparities that there are in the country, tracing back to historical injustice. And there's definitely a view that it is unjust to not take active steps to correct or remediate those. I don't think you can understand justice in terms of distributions of things. I don't think there are just or unjust distributions. I think what's just or unjust is of property and things like that. I think what's just or unjust is the initial way that the property was made or acquired, and then the processes by which it's been transferred since then. And for a lot of property, the initial ways in which it was made or acquired were unjust. For most land around most of the world, I mean, it was not out of any meritorious process, but a lot of warlords and people fighting with one another and dispossessing one another. If you go back in history, any kind of thing that we could recognize as just orders is pretty recent. What to be done about that? And how consequential is it? How much of the disparities in what people have in different places are due to injustices 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 50 years ago, 1,000 years ago, what happened in Assyria way back when? I think you can kind of get a sense of that in different economies by seeing how quickly groups that come in with very little are able to rise in them. And I think that in America, not that much of disparities is caused by the literal legacies of who inherits stuff and who doesn't. Where you can, at a certain point, depending on how fast an economy moves and how quickly people develop, those kind of differences get washed out into the noise of the past. How far back? Hard to say, but not hundreds and hundreds of years. I don't even think 100 years. Where there are specific injustices that aren't that long ago, results of redlining or tax policies that are unfair or so forth, discriminatory, I think we should look into those, find them, and identify the particular victims. And I think we should actually do this, have committees that are looking and trying to find them, and then rectify with the particular victims. But when we're looking at larger scale things than that, where you have populations that are in generational poverty, I don't think the cause is things that happened 100 or 50 years ago. If there are institutional, governmental injustices that are causing it, I think they're present tense ones. And I think there are some present tense ones. I think having crimes against drug use that are non-objective, that can't be uniformly enforced, necessarily leads to situations where they're not uniformly enforced, and they'll therefore be enforced on the people who are least able to provide for good defenses for themselves, therefore the poorest. I think when you have education controlled by a political establishment, there are lots of kinds of ways in which a country's laws can be, in which a country's institutions can be, that when they're that way, I think will make whatever prejudices there are, latent or tacit in the community, kind of come out in the application of those laws, and that will keep whoever is closer to being politically connected better off, and whoever is further from being politically connected worse off. And I think there are plenty of laws like that in America today, less so than in most countries at most times, but still quite a lot. And I think those have some role to play in sustaining some of the disparities that people talk about. I think the drug law is one of them. I think the way public education works is another. And there are probably others I haven't thought of.
Yeah, I think that's a much better route to take, right? And a reasonable perspective on how we address disparities in society. And there's a whole area of the law called remedies when it comes to those sorts of harms that have been visited upon certain individuals or certain groups of individuals, and how to make them whole, and how to identify them, and the connection, and when it becomes too tenuous and so forth. That's not a good way to wrap up, is it? You wanted me to wrap up with something, and that's
Bring
what.
us back maybe to free speech.
Yeah, that's what I think I'll do. First of all, I just want to say thank you very much for being here. Allowing me to be here. This is really a great treat for me to be back talking with you for one, and learning a lot from you again, as I always have, and to be here on the campus of the University of Texas and talking with everyone, and everyone who's on the live streaming will see this. So I hope that you found something interesting to cogitate on. But I just want to say that I think it's pretty clear that free speech, free expression was critical, particularly as we've already discussed in the 20th century, to the advancement of civil rights. Whether or not you have qualms with the civil rights laws that we have, freedom of speech, freedom of expression was critical to those things coming about. I also think that we're not done with social progress. I mean, we see the sorts of the flare up in censorship that we see now, in part because people are so fired up about the fact that we're not done with making social progress in this country. And I don't see a good reason to believe that freedom of speech and freedom of expression, properly understood, is not still a critical element to making the change that we might want to see in society. And then finally, for undergraduates and graduate students who are the principal targets of these conversations, this is important to you. Not just from the 30,000-foot view, it will make you a better citizen in a free country, but also in the here and now, to develop into the professionals and the adults that you surely want to be for the various reasons that we've discussed. And so I encourage you to support a radical vision of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Be prepared to be triggered, be prepared to be offended when you hear other people's speech. But if you're not a radical when it comes to that, you really are closing off an opportunity for your own intellectual development. And it really leads to, in my view, I think there's no other legitimate view, to intellectual death. So prepare to be triggered. In fact, seek those opportunities out. That's the only and best way that you're going to learn, become sharper, smarter, and really be the type of citizen that we all deserve in a free society.
If all the right views about what kind of society was most just and what kind of steps would lead to getting there, if all the correct views on those subjects were ascendant in the culture, such that they were preached from every mountaintop, almost everyone believed them, it was taboo to say anything contrary to that, then we would be rapidly racing towards a better, more just, ideal society if we wouldn't be there already. If you don't think we're rapidly racing there, if you don't think we're there now or nearly there, it's got to be because some of the ideas that people hold, some of the ideas that are deeply ingrained, are wrong. And if some ideas about things that deep are wrong, we're not going to find them out and correct them other than by discussion of them. And that includes hearing things that strike us as really wrong at first. So I think if we don't think our society's got it nailed right, if we don't think we've perfected it, then we've got to allow that there might be things that we ourselves are wrong about, that the most popular views in the culture are wrong about, and we've got to be willing to have those really difficult discussions, willing to challenge ourselves, willing to hear our ideas be challenged. Otherwise, we're not going to find out what's wrong and how to fix it. Got to be willing to be triggered, as you put it. So with that, let's call tonight to a close, or at least call this session to a close. Thank you very much for being here. It's been a pleasure to reconnect with you.
Fantastic.
And thanks everybody for coming. And I believe we'll be back with another episode of Choose Your Issues, probably with me and Ben Bayer on Tuesday. Until then, good night.
Good night.